Pathway students. So today I'm going to be doing just kind of a few thoughts on my reading the other night on Daniel, and we're going to be focusing on the character of Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar. We're only going to go through the first 4 chapters. I'm going to really focus on those 2 characters and some cool things that happens in their relationship and their interactions with each other. The book of Daniel is really amazing, and Daniel himself is really good at adapting to the circumstances that he is in and continually being faithful to God when he is in them. So first, Judah is besieged by Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar. So many of the Judean people are then taken into exile to live in Babylon. So then, while they're in this area of exile, the king then decides to round up all of the good-looking people, the good-looking young men of the Judean nation, and then he takes them and he puts them into training to then use for his courts. And Daniel and 3 of his friends that we're not going to get too close of a look into today are of those men. So they kind of go into this together. So real early we see that Daniel is kind of taken away from his country, his family, although he does have these close friends with him. But he's put into this tough circumstance that he has to really deal with. So his name is also literally changed to Belteshazzar by the king. This is one of the gods of the kings that he serves. So immediately, being a very devout Jew following God's law, his name is literally changed to something that he holds as very kind of evil and against his nature. And that just has to be one of the things that he lives with while he's in this new nation. So when he's brought before the king, a little bit before that time, he has to be, fed and trained. And part of that is this. With these young men, they're fed the food from the king himself, and part of the law prohibits them from eating this food, so it keeps him from doing that. So he asked, which could be very, very dangerous for his life, he asked the guard to give him only vegetables and water, him and his friends. And it's really cool to see how God provides for them. Even during that time, God gives them even more strength, and he makes them look better than any of the other men for that little period of trial that the guard gives them. And for the rest of that, the guard's like, okay, I will trust you with that. I'll give you just vegetables. So he allows them to eat just those vegetables and stay clean according to the law. And this is one of Daniel's first really instances of deciding I'm going to stick to the law rather than conform to this new land. Even though I'm in this new land and I have to live this new way, I'm still going to follow God's laws. And it's a pattern that we're going to see in Daniel's character. And it begins to affect greater and greater people. So first, he just affects this guard, and the guard's like, wow, you knew what you were talking about there. Your God's rules protected you. And we get to see that pattern kind of go up and up in officials in the nation of Babylon, and it's really cool throughout the story. So then God gives incredible wisdom to him and his friends in order to help him through the circumstances that he has been placed in. So Daniel is expected to be a very wise man. He has to learn all of these things along with his friends because that's part of his position now. He's to be trained up by the king. And God sees that, and he provides for Daniel. He gives them wisdom of all kinds of understanding and learning. And he and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they end up surpassing so many others among them in those exiles and all the other people rounded up. There's no one in the land found like them. And people take notice of that they haven't just wasted away in their circumstances, but they have really focused on living their life for God and continuing in faithfulness. So we see that he's been given incredible wisdom, and then the king has a dream, and he wants the wise men to tell him what this dream means. And none of them can. And eventually, he sends out a decree that all the wise men should be killed because they can't do this. Daniel and his friends are in that group. But Daniel, the first thing that he does is he prays. He asks his friends to pray that God has mercy on them. And he goes to sleep, and that night he has a vision, and God allows him to interpret the dream. So first off, know the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar, and then to interpret it. The first thing he does right after he gets up is he gives this beautiful song of praise to God, or kind of song or poem, and he sings this to God. And it just shows that he really trusted on God to give him this providence, and right after that providence was given, he gave thanks to God immediately because he knew that mercy was given to him in that moment. So eventually he goes to the king, he gives this interpretation, and the king is just astounded. He's like, wow, you you have incredible wisdom. I'm going to put you in charge of so many things. So here's one of the first interactions we see with Daniel and the king, and that the king instantly sees that there's something very different about Daniel versus all of the other wise men and soothsayers and astronomers around him. He sees that something about the God that you serve is so much greater than all of the other gods around here. And the king instantly takes notice of this, and he realizes Daniel is a man that should be put in charge of a lot of things. So Daniel is then put in charge of all these sorcerers, astronomers, magicians, and all these things. And that's another, it might seem really cool at first, but that's another challenge for Daniel. He is a law-abiding Jew. He follows God's laws. And all of a sudden, he's put in charge of this kind of hodgepodge group of magicians and sorcerers and astronomers, and he doesn't believe in that. In fact, he believes a lot of that is evil. And that's a really challenging position for him to be in. And we don't get to hear a lot about that. But we can tell from later on in the story that he handled that very well, and that the king ends up respecting him even more so, kind of seeing how he handles this work. So let's see. In the 4th chapter, something really amazing happens. The king, it starts off in this form of a letter from the king to his people. And the king starts off with praising God. This is King Nebuchadnezzar. He just took over Judah. He has all of their people exiled in his lands. And then this letter starts off with him praising their God. So we can first off see that an amazing transformation has happened in King Nebuchadnezzar's mind. And now the rest of chapter 4 kind of explains where that came about. So he starts telling a story a while back. So he says, I had another dream. And we're not going to get too much into what these dreams were. But he then, calls in all these wise men again, that Daniel is in charge of, and they can't explain a thing to him. They, again, just like last time, they just don't have the wisdom that God gives. They are trying to use other things to get to just an end that is not possible for them. It's not possible for the wisdom of this man. But Nebuchadnezzar remembers this, and he calls in Daniel, and he says, you have, the wisdom of the one true God. And I want to hear what you have to say from him. And there's a little twist this time. Instead of asking Daniel to tell him his dream, he tells him. So we can see that there's trust forming between the king and Daniel. And he recognizes again that God's power is still within him. So he tells him the dream, and we see something interesting in Daniel. He then feels sad for the king. This is a king that has taken over his lands, probably killed many, many of his family and his friends, and put them all in exile. And then he feels sad for the king. He says, King, I wish this wasn't for you. And he tells him the interpretation of the dream. And basically, it tells that King Nebuchadnezzar will be humbled by God because all of his pride and his just greediness and many of the other sins in his life. And Daniel urges him to repent from all these things. And King Nebuchadnezzar is amazed that he was able to interpret this dream, but he doesn't really take this interpretation to heart. So we then see later on in this letter that King Nebuchadnezzar is writing, he says, I was standing there one night on, overlooking my kingdom. And he says, look at this amazing place that I have built. And then right then the voice of God, he hears it and he's struck down, and that interpretation that Daniel had given him comes true. So he ends up becoming kind of like a beast of the land. He he loses his mind for a little bit. He lives out in the fields. He drinks the dew off the grass, and this is for a long period of time. And then part of that vision was that then at the end of this period of time, he would look up to heaven and he would see, and he would recognize that God is the one true God. And we can see that this happens at the very end. He looks up and he realizes that God is the one true God again, and that he is just a man that has been given all these things. And he's actually restored all of these things that he's lost. He's restored to his kingdom. And that's when he's writing this letter and sending it out to all of his people. He sees that God is the one true God, and he gives praise to him. So this one exile, Daniel, is brought into this kingdom. He works really hard, but most of all, he puts his faith in God, and he never tries to provide something for himself. He always is relying on God to give him what he needs to get him through the circumstances. And through doing this, everyone around him is absolutely amazed by how much talent, how much wisdom just flows out of this man. Literally all the kings further in this book that come into contact him are like, I want you in charge of my kingdom. They just put him in charge of so many things. And they can see that this man that is truly faithful to God is what they want in charge of the kingdom. And through this, he has relations with kings, further and further down the line that are really amazing. And a lot of good things come out of them. And I think a lot of people were exposed to God through him. So I was just kind of thinking about what would it look like in our lives if we were really, really faithful to God, to be relying on his wisdom, to be relying on the strength that he gives us and his talents that he's given us to look at, in order that when we're going into those difficult circumstances where we feel totally displaced, where we don't know what's going on, kind of like moving up to a new grade, moving into a new school, just all of these changes that come with moving up in life, getting older. What would it look like if we really put our faith and our trust in God and tried to use those talents that he has given us for his glory no matter what? All right, Pathway students, that's it from me. I'll see you guys later. Have a good day.